Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very inspiring show coming right up with special guest Michael Jauer, and he's here to share with us his new book, Sensitive Soul: The Unseen Role of Emotions in Extraordinary States. Now, Michael is an emotional researcher and expert on sick building syndrome. His expertise is the nexus of personality development, mind, body, emotion, and spirituality. Michael blogs for Psychology Today and is the co-author of The Spiritual Anatomy of Emotion and Your Emotional Type. So let's welcome to the show, Michael Jauer.
Marianne, it's a pleasure.
Yeah, what an honor it is to have you here and to talk about this book. And I have to ask you, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, I've always been interested in how human beings work. And especially, this is still election season, I suppose. People have different ways of viewing the world and different feelings about themselves and everybody else in the world and things that are going on. And just the fact that people lead distinctly different lives and have different perceptions has always been of interest to me, the psychology of that, and especially the biology of that, because I've become convinced that a lot of our beliefs, our assumptions about the world are really built on the way we process things emotionally. That's sort of the framework that I've arrived at, and it seems to describe things pretty well.
So when we look at, because a lot of people will either talk about the psychology of it, rarely do you hear the biology also intertwined in this. And when you were doing your research, what made you realize that that actually is a key component as well?
Well, the term sensitivity, I think, is central to my work. And I've just become aware over many years and many different situations and environments that people have varying levels of sensitivity to just about anything. It really depends on the person. I first became aware of this when I was doing some work with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and looking into so-called sick building syndrome, which is where, this is back actually in the 1990s, this is where buildings are called sick because a certain percentage of people in those buildings, working in those buildings, feel ill. And oftentimes it can be traced back to something in the building environment, the operations of the building or some particular point sources in the building. But it occurred to me at that time, I just wondered as I talked to people who'd been affected by so-called sick buildings, poor indoor air quality, that not everybody in a building was affected in the same way. Actually, the World Health Organization's definition of a sick building is 20% of building occupants feel ill, but that means 80% don't. And in my talking to people who've been affected by these conditions, it just sort of triggered the question in my mind, well, what separates these folks from the rest who are going through their day just fine and aren't affected in the least? One sort of more banal example for me is in a movie theater. If I smell buttered popcorn around me, I'm not a happy camper. That is just not a smell that I enjoy. And so the biology of that, literally, what are people reacting to in their environment that makes their perceptions so much different from somebody else? So the biology of it is really what sort of jumped out, and that's what I've sort of the line of inquiry I've pursued ever since.
I can understand why that is, because there's so much that's driven by the biology of our experiences. And I was real impressed with how you brought that all together in a way that makes it really, easy for people to understand and how this comes together.
Yeah, it's biology, and you could equally use the term physiology. I've sort of arrived at a sense of things that emotion, literally what animates us, what energizes us, is kind of a flow within our bodies. And some days we feel like that flow is stronger, we're more energetic, other days less so. I relate it almost to money. The metaphor would be the coins and the bills that we carry around with us. We really need money, in effect, to survive, so it goes along with us every day. Some days we're more flush with it, and other days where we have less of that resource, I suppose. But it's sort of a constant in our lives, and I believe emotion from a biological and even a spiritual sense is somewhat similar. We can be more activated about certain things at certain times under certain circumstances. And what I've done is to really trace the individual variations. There's a concept called thick and thin boundaries, which gets at the differences from person to person in how sensitive they are and what affects them and what motivates them and what they react to most strongly. And so that's kind of the framework that I've pursued, is the thick and thin boundaries.
So you titled your book Sensitive Soul. What does that mean?
Well, I'm convinced that, everyone is sensate. Everyone is sentient. So we're all sensing every single moment of our lives, even when we're asleep. We're unconscious, but the body is still functioning. The body is still sensing. In fact, we may be sensing more of our internal milieu, you might say, or subconscious thoughts and feelings in dreams, of course, than we do during our waking day. So everyone is sensate, and I'm convinced that there's a spectrum of people's reactivity, and their susceptibility even to different prompts. And so that's really the sensitive part of Sensitive Soul. And the soul relates to the fact that we are spiritual beings. We have mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual parts of us that all come together, even if we're not noticing. So my work really relates the sort of the material, the biological, the physiological, with the emotional and the mental and spiritual parts of it. And Sensitive Soul is just a term to sum that up.
Well, you really do dovetail all of that together so people can understand and really look at this perhaps in a new way than they ever have before. What were some of your findings that you discovered regarding like the social, emotional aspect of sensitive people?
Well, this gets to the concept of thick and thin boundaries. And I think it's a fascinating subject. I learned about it from a guy named Ernest Hartman, who unfortunately is no longer with us, but Ernest was a psychiatry professor at Tufts University, and he had delved into nightmares that certain people would have. And the more he studied them, the more he realized that there are what he called dream people and daytime people. and his framework he developed, Boundaries, really gets at the essential differences in how we function. There are certain people who are maybe so bothered by something that in the middle of the night it wakes them up, and they can't let go of that particular dream. It's just something that has them in its grip. There are other people that he studied and that we just know in the course of our daily lives. There's some people that just don't even remember their dreams. Or they might dream in black and white. I tend to dream in color, but other people dream in black and white. For some people, dreams are quite memorable, and they really delve into them and try to figure them out. Other people, they're sort of just trivial and of no consequence. So this really explains one difference between us. And there are many more, but the whole idea of boundaries and the emotional prompts that are at work in various different kinds of people, I think that's key. One framework I think that's also been useful, and listeners might be intrigued by this, is the concept of orchids and dandelions. The idea that there's a variety of types of people in the world. Some people are maybe hardier in their surroundings. They're not affected by as much emotionally. It's closer to what Hartman would call a thick-boundaried person, somebody who sort of perseveres, works things out, isn't tremendously ruffled by things, gets through the day just fine. Whereas orchids are people that are constitutionally more sensitive and more susceptible to whatever's happening in their environment, the way that they're nurtured, their their upbringing, things that people say to them during the course of the day, and they tend to be more at risk for different types of ailments related to stress and anxiety. But the orchid dandelion framework suggests that if an orchid gets really good attention and is watered and taken care of ideally, then it's likely to really bloom and prosper in ways that are highly significant, and that type of person could excel even more than the hardier dandelions. And all the studies that have been done suggest that about 20% of the population is this thin boundary orchid-type person, whereas the balance of people are more on the thick boundary or dandelion side. So it's just very interesting how different people work.
Have you found that there's any correlation to how trauma affects people? Because I know you have this, you really kind of have a focus on trauma in the book, which I found very helpful.
Yes, the word trauma is used a lot in the book, and that's purposefully because thin boundary people are definitely affected by much more in the course of their day than other types of people. And something that would be not traumatic at all for one type of person might be something that really affects deeply a more sensitive person. So there are all kinds of effects of trauma, and a lot of it has to do with the extent to which people are able to feel their feelings. And again, there are differences here. Thin boundary people, the more orchid type of person, they tend to feel their feelings rather deeply and ruminate on them, and that's why their dreams tend to be more colorful and more memorable. Whereas for most other people, feelings aren't quite so important. They're not quite so pressing and intense. And so therefore, if a person's in a difficult situation, if it transmutes into trauma, it relates to the way that person is feeling or not feeling in that particular situation. So the term dissociation I also use a lot. That's when a person is, for whatever reason, not feeling their feelings. They're distanced from their feelings. And dissociation is a typical reaction in a traumatic situation. If there's an emergency, people often they're reacting, they're responding, they're not 100% cognizant of what they're feeling. They might later on look back and say, oh, that was scary, or that was challenging. But in the moment, they're doing what they need to do to handle it or to survive, to get through it. Dissociation is necessary. It's just the way we're wired. But for some people, it can become chronic. PTSD is a good example. There are different types of PTSD based, in my estimation, and I set this out in the book, on how people are able to bounce back or not from a traumatic situation. And some people with PTSD, some hallmark of the original trauma will remind them keenly of it, and they'll be back in that situation. It's sort of like a flashbulb memory, and they have all the physiological hallmarks of what they went through originally. With other people whose dissociation pattern is different, some reminder of that original trauma will register with them, but it won't be as intense. They may be aware that there's something bothering them, but they can't quite put their finger on it. And whereas for the other type of PTSD, it's like an alarm bell that's just clanging at 1,000 decibels. For other types of people whose dissociation is more systemic, they are just sort of affected by a sense that something's not right. It just can't put their finger on it, but it's kind of a low-level depressive kind of outlook that they have. So this kind of gets to the way trauma plays out differently for different types of people.
So I know in your book you talk about how PTSD is a modern day plague. And it's interesting when you look at that because I think most people, while a lot of people have PTSD, looking at it in this way, I think is new for a lot of people.
Yeah, I don't think folks are generally aware that there are subtypes of PTSD. The way it's typically portrayed on television, in the movies, and in the medical literature, it's one thing. People think of post-traumatic stress disorder as one thing, and it's not. It plays out differently for different types of people. Again, this depressive subtype of PTSD, I believe, it affects from 20 to 40% of people that have PTSD that are grappling with the consequences of trauma in that way. So it's reasonably well documented in the literature. It's just not in the public mind so much. But as I say, it really gets to the core issue of how people process their feelings. And I'm convinced that people come into the world sort of primed to be a certain place on that thick to thin boundary spectrum. Of course, their upbringing has a lot to do with it. But the more sensitivity is studied, the more evidence there is that genetics actually sort of set the table for a lot of people.
So what has your research shown for people who have autism or other overlapping senses?
Well, this, Marianne, came together rather gradually and sort of unexpectedly in the last few years. I'm not certain initially what about autism sort of spoke to me as something that I would want to study, and especially look at from the framework of thick and thin boundaries. I think it was, in particular, it might have been an article about a theory called it's framed as the intense world theory. The idea is that people with autism, especially kids, while it seems that they're sort of tuned out of typical human interactions, they're not necessarily engaged or able to be very verbal. They might engage in sort of strange behaviors, go off by themselves. And so it would seem that they're not emotionally involved with the world. The intense world hypothesis suggests that it's the opposite, that they are beset by so many different kinds of stimuli that they can't really get a handle on, that they sort of retreat into their own world, and they become autistic as a reaction to too much stimuli. And there's actually very good evidence presented for that theory. It may not explain everyone with autism, but it indicates that the people with autism may indeed have a lens on the world, at least initially as kids, that the rest of us don't really appreciate, and it does overwhelm them. So autism is a fascinating subject, and it led me to study other kinds of conditions. For example, synesthesia, which is where people also report being overwhelmed by a whole lot of stimuli, lights, sounds, colors. People who are synesthetic, they experience different perceptions that overlap. So they might taste a shape, or they might feel a sound. It's a very interesting way of perceiving the world. And there are statistically some correlations between autism and synesthesia. So there may be some genetic overlap between people who are synesthetes and others who are autistic. Some interesting questions there. But again, it raises this whole question of nature and nurture and how people come into the world, and to what extent they may be overstimulated. There may be just the volumes, you might say, the volume of stimuli is just too much for them.
I was real impressed about how in your book you also talk about near-death experiences. And I'd love for you to share why that was important to include in your book.
So, Marianne, a lot of what I've been studying is the embodied self, what it is to walk around in the world and take everything in and be who you are. And in studying some of these different types of people and different types of conditions that affect folks differently, I began to realize that everyone's experience is their own and is not necessarily what someone else is going to be feeling and perceiving. And the sense of embodiment that people have can differ. And so I started looking at out-of-body and near-death experiences where people seem to be outside of themselves. Now, you could look at that pathologically, and a lot of scientists do. They say that something's gone wrong in the brain, basically. It's like a seizure to them. And therefore, the perceptions don't really have legitimacy. They can be explained by a particular region in the brain, say. But there are instances where people describe their surroundings quite accurately when they have an out-of-body or near-death experience. This is all anecdotal, but there's a lot of evidence. People have different stories, but they share some of the same features. And so just the way people are embodied or the way they can become disembodied in certain circumstances is fascinating to me. In fact, it's the subject of not only a chapter in Sensitive Soul, but a couple of, it probably grow to be 4 different blog posts on my Psychology Today blog. And so it's just, again, a facet of what it is to be human, and the more light we can shed on it, and I think the better that we can home in on who are the people that are having these experiences, under what conditions, that tells us a lot about what makes people function. And individual differences, again, is a key theme and an interest of mine.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of curiosity when it comes around the discussion of near-death experiences, because people are always wanting to know, if the mind survives the body, and if there is anything, is there another side? What happens to consciousness? And so it really kind of buttons down some of those questions, and you approached it from a very unique perspective, and I really appreciated that.
Well, and also the subject of apparitions. When people report sort of ghostly occurrences and feeling something that's outside of them, or seeing something or hearing something, again, that can be poo-pooed, but a lot of people report apparitional experiences, and I'm convinced there's more than meets the eye there. Again, I think that the evidence shows that it's more highly sensitive people, it's thin boundary people who report these kinds of perceptions more frequently. And I suspect it's because they're open to more different kinds of stimuli, especially the emotional nuances in an environment. There are thin boundary people who can walk into a room and they can tell you what was happening in that room half an hour ago. And they can sort of surmise the emotional dynamics of that place. Now, again, you can look at that and say that's really hard to pin down, and therefore, if we can't really explain it, then maybe they're making this up. I approach it differently. I think that people have different capacities, more nuanced capacities to understand emotionally what's going on. And for some people, their boundary with the world is much more porous. And so I think they're literally taking more information in. And my theory, or my presumption, and I explain this especially in my first book, which is called The Spiritual Anatomy of Emotion, is very much about what may be going on in situations where there's allegedly an apparition that someone talks about, or even poltergeist phenomena, weird things happening in the environment like that. I do believe there's an explanation for it, and it has to do with emotional energy in the environment and what people are either perceiving or even perhaps triggering themselves.
Well, that's very interesting, because I think a lot of people are like, oh, wait a minute, I must have a ghost in my house. Things move around. And so, maybe there's a greater discussion to that.
Yeah, I've had some interesting experiences myself where in one case a light bulb fell out of its fixture in the ceiling, literally just fell out. In another situation, also having to do with the light fixture, it wasn't the bulb, but it was sort of the covering for the bulb that fell out, and just kind of shook me because there was a clatter in the other room, and I went to see what it was. And in both those situations, I recall I was kind of emotionally riled up about something. And I remember pacing back and forth and really trying to come to grips with this situation. And I don't think it was a coincidence that these things took place. Likewise, I've had other experiences, my family as well, involving pets who died. And in a couple cases, these were cats of ours. We're very emotionally caring for them, and I think vice versa. Just shortly after their death, weird things happened. In one case, my wife and I, there was a knock at the door, and there was no one there. It was out of the blue, and it happened just at the moment when I was explaining to my daughter, who was, I think, all of 2 years old at the time, that this kitty cat had died and was not coming back. And I was not riled up, but I was beginning to get emotional because I was thinking, how do I explain this to my daughter in terms that she can understand? This was a beloved cat that I think had been with us for something like 14 years. And just at that moment that I was getting down at eye level to talk with her about this, that's when we heard this knock at the door. And my wife bounded down the steps. We had the door open within about 5 seconds, and there was nobody there. But it was a distinct knocking sound. Another situation involving an animal was, and I addressed this in Sensitive Soul, my daughter's favorite cat. A number of years later, my daughter was probably about 14 at this point. This kitty cat died, and what happened immediately after was that she had a particular stuffed animal that happened to be about the same size, shape, and color as the kitty cat. My daughter's favorite stuffed animal. It disappeared for several days, which was very disquieting to us because, like a lot of kids, my daughter treasured that particular stuffed animal, and she had taken it to bed that evening for comfort after we realized that our kitty had died. And in the morning, the stuffed animal wasn't there, and it wasn't there for several more days until it miraculously reappeared in the middle of her bedroom, right on the floor. None of us could have missed it. Parapsychologically, it's known as an apport, an object that seems to have some sort of symbolic or emotional value that appears and reappears. So that's freaky, but it's true. I've written about it in the book. I've blogged about it. There are also many other people, including skeptics, who have made a name for themselves as folks who don't believe anything can be genuinely parapsychological. There are skeptics that have had similar experiences themselves. And again, I just focus on the emotional dynamics of the situation, and I think that holds the key to explaining why certain things happen when they do that seem bizarre.
Well, I'm so glad you shared those stories with us, and I'd love for you to explain your thoughts on Deja Vu.
Deja Vu, everyone knows what it is, and nobody knows why it is. And there are a lot of folks in neuroscience working on deja vu and a lot of different theories over the years. I surveyed a bunch of them, and there may be more than one explanation for deja vu, but the explanation that I alighted on and that I explain in Sensitive Soul, again, has to do with dissociation, feelings that sort of go underground. And I think what happens is that you get in a situation where you have deja vu, you've got a little glimmer of maybe a previous situation that felt threatening in some way, or that just was not to your liking. And it's sort of automatic that that goes underground, that memory goes underground, rather than being fully acknowledged and embraced and explored. So to me, deja vu is like a tripwire. It just indicates something that happened, an echo of something that is now manifest immediately in front of you, the situation that you're in. But whatever that emotional association is, it's threatening, and so you don't do anything with it. You put it aside, and that's why it seems both familiar and very, puzzling and strange that you can't quite grasp it.
So in your book, you talk about mirror senses, and I'd love for you to explain to us what that's all about. And if you have an example, it'd be great to hear it too.
Right. Mirror senses are a facet of certain people that are highly empathic. They tend to be thin boundary people, very often synesthetes. And I mentioned synesthesia is overlapping senses, like hearing a touch, or quite common is seeing words or sounds in color. That's probably the most prominent type of synesthesia. There are a lot of synesthetes that have mirror touch or mirror pain, and it's the ability, and I think it really is an ability, certainly a characteristic of certain people, that if they see something happening to someone else, and it has to do very often with touch. If they're seeing, let's say something on television or in the movies where someone's hit in the face, they'll feel as if they've been hit in the face. If someone is reacting strongly to something, they seem to be tearing up, or something got into their eye, and they're sort of touching their eye. So the person with the mirror sense, sense of mirror touch, he or she is going to feel as if their eye is irritated, that kind of thing. And it's a fascinating area that a lot of neuroscientists are studying right now. It's been explained as occurring to people who have what's called self-other confusion, which is not a very flattering phrase, but the idea is that people with mirror senses don't have a very strong boundary between themselves and other people. And so they sort of model what they see, and so it feels as if it's happening to them, what's actually happening to another person. One interesting facet of this, Marianne, is that there's even a mirror touch that people with, I'm trying to think of the word, if they're missing a limb, for some reason the word isn't occurring to me right now, but if someone's missing a hand or an arm or a leg or a foot, amputees, that's what I'm trying to say, amputees that have phantom pain in the part of the limb that's missing, and it's fairly common. If someone has a body part amputated, they'll feel some sensation for a period of time where that limb used to be, or that finger, or whatever it happens to be. and often they'll feel as if it's right there. There are reports, for example, of people that had rings on their fingers, and then that they had to have the fingers removed, and they still feel the sensation of the ring around that particular finger. It can be very uncomfortable. It can also, for other people, be kind of reassuring in the sense that they're missing that finger or that part of their hand or arm, but it reminds them of what they used to have. Anyway, there are folks with this type of phantom pain who are also they also evidence mirror touch. So it's not only that they're recollecting something that they used to have physically in their person, they're also able to sense what somebody else may be feeling. And again, especially it has to do with pain. If they're watching a movie or a boxing match or something like this, and someone is hit, someone is cut, someone is injured, the person with the amputee, that is, will feel that very keenly. And so it seems to have a lot to do with empathy. It's kind of an open question why certain people are sort of wired this way. But to me, it indicates that the way we apprehend emotionally is critical, and that we can literally go beyond ourselves and connect with other people in meaningful ways, even if it's just sort of the way we're wired. We don't have a say in it. There may be something that happened to somebody, and they a body part was amputated. Wouldn't wish that on them. But because they're configured that way now, they've gone through something traumatic, they seem to have a greater disposition to empathize with others in this mirror in this mirror way, so that they are apprehending perhaps what someone else is feeling. So you could almost say it's a form of ESP, but it's a very intense, very clear physical sensation that these people have, and there's a lot to study and learn.
Oh my goodness, yeah, it's very fascinating. And you also mentioned in your book, you talk about birthmarks and remembered lives. And I love that because I actually know somebody who explores that. And I'd love for you to share with us your thoughts around that.
So I delve into this in the last chapter of Sensitive Soul. And it brings up some of the most profound questions about what it is to be human. There was a guy at University of Virginia by the name of Ian Stevenson, who was quite a pioneering researcher. He collected meticulously documented cases, tens of thousands of cases of children generally living in other countries, in Asian countries for the most part, but not entirely, who seemed to remember at a young age living someone else's life. And Ian Stevenson and his colleagues were able, in many of those cases, to document a similar situation, something that had actually happened to somebody, and there was a record of their death in a village that might have been 50 miles away. But there were records that they could correlate with the seeming recollections of these kids, and also their particular, very intense likes, dislikes, fears. If they were afraid of airplanes, for example, with no seeming reason, the child might say that he or she remembered being a Japanese soldier and being strafed in World War II, for example. Some of that they were actually able to track down when there were details sufficient for them to do so. But really raises the question of what is motivating very young children to report very strong perceptions when there didn't seem to be anything in their current life that could account for them. Some of these cases are even where a young child, let's say a young boy, will have very strong female predilections, or vice versa, that a girl will want to be a boy at an early age. It just raises fundamental questions about how we come into the world and what might have taken place to someone else that may correspond to what that child is recollecting. There are a couple cases in the book that I report from the person at the University of Virginia who's carried on Ian Stevenson's work, Jim Tucker and his colleagues, and what they've ascertained is over these thousands of cases, tens of thousands of cases, in about 70% of them, where they were able to document what might have taken place based on records of somebody else who had died or suffered some sort of injury. In 70% of the cases, it does involve a trauma, and to me, that's a critical number, because the way I explain this in the book is that there may be something in these situations happening to that individual who's in peril that causes some remembrance of what's happening to them to be transferred, in effect, to someone who's born later on. One outstanding example of this, Marianne, is a boy named James Leininger, who, as described by Jim Tucker, when he was about 2 or 2.5 years old, he started playing with toy airplanes and banging them into the living room table of his parents' house. And he would yell, "Airplane on fire, little man can't get out." And he would just slam these little toy airplanes into the table so that it was completely dented. And his parents wondered what the heck could be going on. And they contacted Jim Tucker, and I think it was also because of the things that their son was saying. He was talking about a ship called Natoma, which I remember his father said to him, "James, that sounds like a Japanese name." And the boy said, No, Dad, it's American." So he seemed to have recollections of being in some sort of a battle in an airplane and not being able to get out, and the airplane exploding and his dying. And so he would wake up at night and have nightmares, and these would intrude into the day as well. So Jim Tucker came out, and they talked to him, and his father, James Leininger's father, also did some research, and they ascertained that an aircraft carrier, I think in 1945, operating, or maybe it was 1944, operating outside of Iwo Jima, called the USS Natoma Bay, had lost a pilot who his nickname was Little Man, and there were other details that James gave, indicating his best friend and where the best friend was from, or where he himself, the Little Man, was from. And they actually identified the pilot who was killed inside this plane during this battle. So there are situations like that just seem to come completely out of the blue. You also were asking about birthmarks, and I neglected to answer that, but a lot of the cases that Stevenson and Tucker and colleagues have documented is someone with some sort of actually a birthmark or some sort of abrasion or contusion that seems very strange, that they come into the world as a baby with this, and then later on they tell about being someone else. And for example, if they recollect that this person was killed by gunfire, there might be a mark seeming to correspond to the path of the bullet that maybe went through their stomach or went through their chest. And so there are situations like this that are quite remarkable. And Stevenson and Tucker have really been ace detectives in assessing what evidence there might be that lines up. And in many cases, it lines up strangely well. And again, it raises the question of what sort of experiences can convey, highly emotional experiences that maybe convey from one lifetime to another. I'm not saying that it's a case of direct reincarnation, but I'm looking at the actual physical trauma and the emotional trauma overall that somebody might be going through. And in a spiritual sense, are there echoes of that can affect someone 50 years later in a completely different circumstance?
Yeah, I mean, that is so fascinating how that all comes together. And it makes perfect sense because, I mean, you get these young people who have no idea. And here, you have this young boy that's, talking about experiences and places that he would have no knowledge of unless he was personally there. Correct. And then these very intense memories seem to fade by around the age of 6, typically. So there's a window where kids will relate these very emotional, apparent recollections, but then that window closes after a time, and they just move on with their current life. My goodness, Michael. I mean, we can talk for hours. I mean, your book, Sensitive Soul, is just remarkable. I really loved reading it. Where can our listeners connect with you and learn about not just this book, but all of your other work as well? Well, they can go to the website, which is michaeljower.com, Jawer, michaeljower.com, and it's intended as sort of a portal into all 3 books. The first one is called The Spiritual Anatomy of Emotion, and as I mentioned, that goes into really more of the parapsychological experiences that some people have and what kind of, especially emotional framework could help to explain that, tied to different types of personalities. My second book, also written with Dr. Mark McCosey, as the first one was, is called Your Emotional Type, and that focuses on the kinds of illnesses and health conditions that people are susceptible to at various points along the thick to thin boundary spectrum, and what type of treatments, especially complementary and alternative treatments, will help people that have particular kinds of conditions. And then, of course, the third book is Sensitive Soul, and that really delves more into the sort of spiritual upshot of everything we've been talking about, and in particular conditions like autism, synesthesia, savantism, child prodigies, and as we were mentioning, children that seem to remember someone else's life, as well as deja vu and migraine and a lot of other things under the sun. Well, Michael, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today. Well, Marianne, it's a pleasure. This is, to me, very interesting terrain. I'm glad that it is to you as well. I've appreciated your questions and the opportunity to delve into it a bit. Well, thank you, Michael. It has been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about your new book, Sensitive Soul. Sensitive Soul's available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all indie retailers. And if you don't see it on the shelf, ask for them to order it. And of course, it's available on Kindle. Again, if you'd like to connect with Michael, you can at michaeljower.com for more information. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You're listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Sunday, Monday, Thursday, and Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern and 5 p.m. Pacific Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.